Greetings and various assorted salutations. Welcome to another lecture. This is for U.S. government, though it is a bit more U.S. history themed. The purpose of today's lecture is to give a quick recall of the origins of American democracy in case you forgot them from U.S. history. Government is typically one of the last social studies classes that a student takes at the school I teach at. And so as a result, we kind of expect them to already have all the U.S. history stuff down. But there's some time in the course where I can go back through and give a brief refresher and recontextualize some of the things they've learned previously for more practical use in the current government class. So, laconically put, American democracy grew from old ideas, bold experiments, and a lot of compromise. First up, learning objectives. We've got three, which my green screen cuts off my fingers. Three of them. Summarize key historical influences on U.S. democracy, identify foundational documents and events, explain how early debates shaped politics today. Those are the three things we're looking at here, keeping it relatively straightforward. Of course, we got some key terms and whatnot to deal with, so let's take a look at them. Natural rights. Now, this came up, I believe, in one of the earlier lectures, but these are considered basic rights. Because you are human, you have these rights. To deny someone these rights is to deny them their humanity. Whether these natural rights occur from nature or God, different Enlightenment philosophers argue different ways. They believe that these things are fundamental rights of human existence. Life, liberty, and property, or sometimes property is substitute out for pursuit of happiness in a lot of American contexts. Social contract. Well, we live in a society. And the idea of social contract is that people form a government, they make compromises so that we can live together in community. Humanity often does its best when it's able to live in proximity to one another, and there's some agreements made between people to make interaction go as smoothly as possible. Magna Carta. This is one of those things from the English tradition that Americans pull from. Your world history class probably covered this in more detail, but in 1215-ish, various nobles came together to restrict the king's absolute power. And this shifted England's history from being an absolute monarchy and more in the direction of representative democracy. Sure, it started with the nobles, but you got to start somewhere, I guess. The Mayflower Compact is a byproduct of early American colonial government, self-government. It was created because the Mayflower, it had gone off course and they needed to settle down, but before they set foot on the mainland, they needed to come up with rules and a way to handle disagreements, how to handle business, how to handle interactions with each other. And so the compact is a government for the people, by the people, in an early sense in 1620. The Declaration of Independence is a classic American document. It begins the time-honored tradition of complaining. It's about mostly a list of complaints that the American colonists, soon revolutionaries, had against the British government, parliament, and its king. Mainly those centering around without representation, don't expect us to play nice, or don't expect us to follow rules if we have no say. The Articles of Confederation is another document. It's the first attempt at an American democracy. We'll talk more about it in a little bit. Federalism is another concept we're going to go into detail much later, but it comes up as some of the people inspire the U.S. government kind of lay the groundwork for this one. This idea that the state and the national government, the states and the national government have kind of set aside different responsibilities and there's a division of power. So First up, let's talk about the ideas. American democracy comes from a variety of different sources. I'll just be covering a few of them here, but one of the big sources that the founding fathers are going to list a lot is a lot of classical influences. As you know, democracy comes from the Greek, and many of the founding fathers would have been reading about the city of Athens, the city-state of Athens, and the democracy located there. Um, Also, the founding fathers thought much about the Romans, though mainly they thought about the Roman Republic and less so the empire. The Republic is often pushed aside because the empire lasted longer and had more successful history, and the era of Roman kings is a bit further off in the misty past. But essentially, the Republic was founded after the Romans chucked their king down a flight of stairs and established a republic. Various statesmen and speeches were created in the run of this republic. This republic managed to repel Julius Caesar through a lot of violence, though that's kind of a Roman thing. Et brute. But the Roman Republic was a source of inspiration for the founding fathers. A lot of classical writings, thanks to the Renaissance, an era before, had become more accessible. And so a lot of educated people were reading up on the Greeks and they're reading up on the Romans, and that's a source of inspiration. The Enlightenment is also going to be another source. So if you're thinking back to world history, the Renaissance was rediscovering the Greek and Romans, the classical period. The Enlightenment was kind of, okay, let's go from there. The Enlightenment, vastly oversimplified, suggested that science and reason and observation could help us better understand the world around us. We're focusing more on the political aspect, though. Locke, who we've talked about previously, gave us a lot of ideas about natural rights. The idea that people have rights because they are people, and to deny people those rights is to deny them their humanity. He also lends us this idea of the consent of the governed. You have to remember throughout much of human history, and especially in the time of America's founding, most of the world is ruled by kings, queens, emperors, those who have a divine right to rule, who were chosen by God, something to that effect. And their right to rule is theirs, it's within their family. Nobles, commoners, they exist to serve the monarch. But what Locke suggests is that individual people are much more than servants to some monarch, and that rule of a person, rule over a people, should be determined by the people being ruled over. Vast oversimplification of his writings, but we're just a government class and we're picking up these ideas. We gotta keep moving. Montesquieu is another famous one. He comes from France. He wrote on many things. He was a noted essayist, but primarily what we're going to be pulling from is his concept of separation of powers. Now, many of you may have heard the phrase, with great power comes great responsibility, or something to that effect. People of Montesquieu's nature would say, with great power comes great capacity to do evil. Power concentrated is power abusable. I'll point out various examples in class of power abuse. There's plenty of great examples of 20th century power abuse. The fascist states of World War II are excellent cases of what happens when you have the power concentrated in a very small group. Tragedy and horror ensues. And Montesquieu advocates that power must be divided between different parts of government, and these different parts of government, by being in opposition to each other, are more likely to not take over and do great evil quickly and efficiently, as many would fear. We often also have a lot of early English traditions. This is one of those kind of things from an American standpoint, several hundred years in the future, or 700 years down the road. We often forget we draw a lot of inspiration from the English, the empire that the United States was once part of. The Magna Carta, the English Bill of Rights are just to name a few. Common law is probably one of the larger ones that is drawn from the English political tradition. Common law, roughly defined, is a system of law based on court decisions and customs rather than written laws or statutes. This is where we look at, okay, this has happened before, something similar to this has happened before. Let's look over the evidence, let's look over what happened, and then make a decision based on those things. This is part of the reason why when you get to studying the judicial branch, the court part of the US government, we talk a lot about prior Supreme Court cases because all the Supreme Court cases are referred to in the relevant context that they come up. When we're talking about Native American history or Native American politics, you might be looking at, I believe it's the 1832-ish case of Worcester versus the state of Georgia. That's an important case for understanding the relationship between the national government, the state government, and Native American tribal governments. There's other cases as well when we look at civil rights, things of that nature. But common law is this idea that our system isn't just this cut and dry. You do this, you get that on the chart. It's more than that. The other thing that the colonies had going for them as a source of inspiration was self-governance. Part of the self-governance was due to sheer logistics. Parliament in London just did not have the resources in the 1600s and much of the 1700s to tell the English colonists what to do on a day-to-day basis. The Atlantic Ocean was a far pace. It was a dangerous journey, and it just took too long to have decisions be written up, sent across the pond, processed in London, and then sent back, if they even made it back. Not all the ships, let's just say, traveling wasn't as easy. Not everyone made it. There's probably a bunch of shipwrecks from this era. And so as a result, the colonies pretty much had a lot of governance figured out. The colonial governments would transition into the state governments for the most part, and the city governments and counties, like a lot of the government that we actually have in place is just kind of inherited from the colonial era. Or if we're further, or when you get away from 13 colonies, well, copying and pasting is a time-honored tradition in the regards of this. But there are other things that American government pulls from. These are just some of the big ones that come up a lot. You got to mention the classical influences because there's a lot of Greek and Latin, definitely Latin mentions. And common law is going to play a huge role in better understanding the judicial branch. Here's a painting or a picture of Montesquieu. I apologize if I mispronounce it. My French is not the best. Well, it's terrible. Absolutely terrible. Anyways, the game changer is the American Revolution. We're going to simplify the American Revolution down to this. It's about taxation with representation. The American colonists did not feel they were being represented over in London in Parliament. And without that representation, many colonists felt that it was not appropriate for them to be taxed or have these laws put upon them, which you hear more about, and I think it's U.S. History 1 at our school system, like the Stamp Act, things like that. They didn't like that, you could impose these rules without consulting the colonists who are going to have to follow and execute these rules. That's what the revolution stems from. This is where we get the Declaration of Independence. When you read the Declaration of Independence, it is breaking boldly from the monarchy, and it's putting forth this idea that, government for the people, by the people, rule by the consent of the people. And you're going to there's a lot of Enlightenment things. If you study Enlightenment on your own, we studied Enlightenment briefly in world history, and it came up again in U.S. History 1 at the start, before the Revolution anyways. But when you read about the Enlightenment, you see that the Declaration of Independence and much of the American Revolution's philosophical, like the reason grounding, stems from, what if we took the ideas of the Enlightenment and made them real, and like brought them into the world and tried to run a government based on Enlightenment ideals. So that's where that comes from. This is where the Great Experiment begins. Now, the Great Experiment is a term you hear thrown around periodically. It refers to the experiment of American democracy. Can a government for the people, by the people, survive? Can it thrive? This question of the Great American Experiment is going to be referenced in a lot of literature. It's going to come up a lot. For example, during the Civil War, many people observing the Civil War asked the question, can the Great American Experiment withstand the Civil War? Because in the Civil War, the question was, do we believe in the democratic principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness if we deny some of those things to some people in the population? And the answer is, a house divided cannot stand. And the experiment prevailed because, well, slavery was ended in the United States. The Great Experiment question comes up again when you get to the world wars. Can democracy thrive in the face of tyranny and great evil? You see it come up during the Civil Rights Experiment. Can we follow through on the promises and struggles of those who've come before us with regards to rights for all citizens of the United States of America? We also see the Great American Experiment phrase get mentioned with the Cold War. What is the Great American Experiment in light of the tyranny of absolutist powers in the 20th century? But I'm getting ahead of myself. Ironically, the first attempt at the Great American Experiment fails. The Articles of Confederation is generally considered an absolute failure. It is a knee-jerk reaction from the Civil War, if you want to think of it that way. It rejects a lot of the things that we had from the British government. Powers concentrated in the colonial governments, now the states. The states band together for common defense, and there is a central government, but that central government doesn't have the ability to do taxes, collect taxes. It's there for kind of organizing defense if one of the 13 states is attacked, and it really just doesn't work. And the straw that breaks the camel's back is generally considered Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion was, the states are in crippling debt. The states are running into all these problems, so they raise taxes. And this puts a lot of pressure on people recovering from the American Revolution. Farmers particularly get hit hard by the taxes. They run the risk of losing their lands, their properties, those kind of things. And you have military veterans like Shay who realize, last time we had a problem with the government, we took up arms and kicked them out and started a new one. Maybe we need to do that again, roll the dice and try another government. Shays' Rebellion was a disaster for the Articles of Confederation because the central government could not send support to the state government. And the state government, dealing with Shay, they just couldn't stop him. If they sent people against him, they'd sympathize with him and join their side. The only thing that stopped Shay from, I think, taking out Boston is private wealthy citizens rose up, put together a private militia, and chased him out. This was a problem because the government wasn't able to respond to the crisis. They didn't have sufficient power to do that, and neither the state nor the national government was able to respond to it. And it's worrying when it's rich people stepping in to take care of things. It could be it set a dangerous precedent. So a new thing had to be tried, the U.S. Constitution. But in creating the U.S. Constitution, we're going to run into some problems. American factionalism, if you will. It's a time-honored tradition for the American public to be divided amongst each other. Um, the division in the aftermath of Shays' Rebellion and the failings of the Articles of Confederation was, okay, we need to try something different. How strong should a central federal government be? Are we going to create a tyrant that is local and worse than what we drove out in the revolution? And this leads to the Federalist versus the Anti-Federalist debate. Um, on one side, you've got the Federalists. The Federalists, they really wanted to throw out the entire the entire Articles of Confederation and replace it with the Constitution. They're the main writers and the main authors of the Constitution itself. And what they wanted was a strong central government. Key figures like Alexander Hamilton, as seen in the hit musical Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay, and others, they wanted a strong central government because they believed that a strong government has the power to respond to crises. And crises will determine whether your nation remains free or under somebody else's thumb as a colony. That's what they envisioned. They envisioned a powerful nation with a strong central government. To get people on board, they wrote the Federalist Papers. They wrote a ton of essays on this. There's a nerd joke in there somewhere. But the Federalist Papers are a series of essays that explain different aspects of the U.S. Constitution and why federalism, or having a strong federal government in this context, is important. Their rivals are going to be the Anti-Federalists. Now, the Anti-Federalists, they understand the Articles of Confederation had its problems. They were willing to kind of throw it out too and start over, most of them, a good number of them. But they were worried about the new Constitution. They were worried about a strong central government threatening liberty. If a strong central government is able to crush people or crush organizations or crush the states in the name of we need the strength to respond to the crisis, well, there's this fear of what if the government just continually creates crises and stomps on people? Isn't that a tyrant worse than the one we drove out? That's what the Anti-Federalists would worry about. They really preferred government to have more power at the local level. And there's some aspect truth to this. I mean, both sides have pretty good arguments. The Federalists believe that in the heat of the moment, in a crisis, you need to be able to respond. The Anti-Federalists would say you need to have control. You need to be careful, lest you become the evil that you wish to avoid. But the Anti-Federalists believe that more power should be handled locally. And they're onto something here. The world is a big place. There's a lot going on in the world, and even if you care about global issues, you may not be able to directly impact them, especially in the 1700s with how isolated things could get. But you do have local concerns. You do have concerns of your personal interest, like are the bridges being maintained? Are the laws being enforced? Are things of that nature? And so the Anti-Federalists believed that more power should be concentrated in local government, whether it's the state, the county, the city, things like that. Because those levels of government are smaller level, you're more likely to get involved in them, and you're more likely to know the people in these small groups. If you don't like something in the city, you find like-minded people, your neighbors, and you try and make change. So that's what the Anti-Federalists saw. Key figures would be people like Patrick Henry, who's pictured in the slideshow, George Mason, and Samuel Adams. Their big accomplishment is they'll get us the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, which we'll look at in more detail later. Now, the U.S. Constitution, which I've been talking about a bit here, is a instruction manual for the U.S. government. That's all it is. It's an instruction manual. It sets up how the different branches of government work. It explains like who's responsible for what, how to do this, how to do that. Refer to page 3. Stuff like that. It's like how you read an instruction manual to assemble furniture. You read an instruction manual to maintenance your computer or your car. This is the manual in the glove box for the U.S. government. If you see the word framers right here, that's referring to the people who wrote or framed the Constitution, if you want to think of it that way. And what it does is it sets up a federal government. There's a central government that's located in Washington, D.C., and that it has certain rights and responsibilities. There are other responsibilities that are handled by the states. Whether there's 13 or 50, the states have certain responsibilities. The central government has certain responsibilities. We're going to go into a lot more detail in the coming days and the coming units of this. But a good example of this is, let's say 2 states have a dispute. The federal government would help intervene on that issue and reach an agreement between the 2 states. Now, this is also a document of compromises. And there's a lot of compromises in the U.S. Constitution because there are a lot of different people in the 13 colonies. And they had a few things they agreed on, but they also didn't get along on a lot of other things. One of the big issues was the Great Compromise. How do we count people? How do we have a democracy that represents the people, for the people, by the people, through the people? Do we base it on population? Do we base it on something else? The answer that the Americans went with is both. One part of our government, the House of Representatives, is based on population, representation based on population. And the other half, the legislative branch, the Senate, is every state gets 2 votes. We'll go into it more later. The 3/5 compromise is a topic more covered in U.S. History 1. It's stuff that's been redacted through various amendments. But essentially, one of the problems that early America dealt with is there were a lot of people who, there was a group of people who were anti-slavery for various reasons, whether it was religious or if you go on the Enlightenment, if a person is a slave, they are denied their natural rights, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, or property. And there are some people against slavery in that regard. However, there was a large faction, a very influential faction in the early United States, that they depended on slavery for their livelihood, and they used slave labor extensively. And the problem that the early United States ran into is these 2 groups were able to drive back the British with French help because they worked together. And the framers, the founders, realized that, we've got to figure out how to get these 2 to work together, because if we don't stay united, there are plenty of empires that would happily rule over these recently freed colonies. And this leads us to the really awkward and unpleasant compromise, the 3/5 compromise. For every 5 slaves, you get 3 counted in the voting system. This is more a topic U.S. History 1, and the Civil War kind of ends this discussion. We also have the Electoral College as another compromise, and the Anti-Federalists are going to get the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and basically what that is while the Constitution is a pretty useful document, sometimes you need to make changes to it. And so basically what the amendments are, and the Bill of Rights are the first 10, is stapling on some addendums to the end of the Constitution to be like, oh, change this, here's an update on that, stuff like that. We'll get more into it in the class. Now, the U.S. Constitution, as a result, is a living document. It's one of the oldest living documents for referring to that. It outlines the power of the government. It outlines how states and the federal government interact with each other. It protects individual rights when you tack on the Bill of Rights, and it serves to maintain public order. It's kind of the physical manifestation of our social contract in the United States of America. It's been guiding the nation for 200 plus years. So far, it's a pretty good run. This is where America kind of gets a bit funny, even though the United States is new on the world stage. At I think 250th anniversary is coming up pretty soon. But American democracy is newer than a lot of other countries' democracies. Italy and Germany, for example, are byproducts of revolutions in the 1870s, 1860s, 70s. So the U.S. is technically older than those countries, if you want to be technical and get into an argument with people, which is kind of funny. But that's stuff for another day. In the coming weeks, in the coming units, we're going to look at the U.S. Constitution, we're going to look at the Bill of Rights, and we're going to look at the amendments and how amendments are done. But those are all topics for another day. That's enough for now. Until later.